Hello, and welcome once again to this week's edition of Leafwire's Industry Trailblazers, where we speak with and learn from some of the industry's true pioneers. We're honored today to have with us Trent Overholt, CEO of Ultranative, and specifically its operating company, Noble Pacific, in Santa Ana, California. A little bit of background on Trent. He previously served as CEO of 14th Round, the foremost cannabis design and technology company. And in his career, Trent successfully launched several of California's top 10 cannabis brands, secured tens of millions in seed capital, with hundreds of millions in valuations. Trent, thanks so much for joining us today. It's great to have you. And let's start by hearing how you got started. How'd you get into the cannabis industry?
Good to be here. I had been working in natural products, CPG, did a lot of work in packaging, and previously over a decade in reusable packaging for fresh produce and other fast-moving consumer goods. And I was recruited by the chairman of the board for what was then called Humboldt No Valves. And that was my maiden voyage. It later was renamed doers, and was my title, I believe I was Chief Revenue Officer. So I had sales, marketing, channel marketing. And I would say the most interesting and notable piece of it was how it was not different from previous kind of premium CPG plays. It was natural products. The messaging was really good. We had a partnership with an advertising agency called Anomaly that is excellent. And it was a great start to things because all I really had to learn was this crazy, emerging, evolving regulatory framework and how that fit into, who's protecting who's the steward of the consumer interests. Is it the brand? Is it the regulatory authorities? Is it both? And it's interesting as we fast forward to today because obviously the consumer safety piece has been in the headlines lately. I would also say the experience at 14th Round and Ease was an exceptional piece of interest too. I always say it's a logistics company masquerading as a retailer. And again, regulatory changes impacted how they go to market, literally how they logistically execute their delivery service. But it was a fantastic piece of experience because we sat at this nexus of operating companies that would supply CPG products and then delivery distribution business that indexed around convenience. So with my background in logistics optimization, packaging, CPG, go-to-market strategies, it was a great exposure for me. And ultimately that led to the formation of Ultranative. My partners there and we kicked that off about 3 years ago.
Great. So perfect segue. That was my next question I was going to ask you about. Tell us about Ultranative and Noble Pacific and what appealed to you, what brought you to this current venture.
Yeah. So Ultranative is a holdco and making investments in natural products companies interested in the cannabis industry specifically. Noble Pacific is one of those operating companies. It is a manufacturing company in Santa Ana, California, and we make oil. Very simple, straightforward strategy. For us, this is a foundational play for some other longer term interests in beverage CPG and other things that we think are more attractive after there's some interstate commerce. But for now, we started this with how do we create value for our customers, and specifically for our customers, the consumers themselves. We thought there was an opportunity to bring some manufacturing best practices. The procurement side, raw materials, is its own sort of strategic exercise. You have to be excellent. If you want to make clean oil, you need to buy and process clean trim. There's a lot of things you just can't fix if your raw materials are not of the high quality that the consumer demands. So we really just linked those things together, a strategic procurement exercise, including some acreage that we contract on our own, the manufacturing excellence, which is the Type 6 in Santa Ana, and then focusing on the sales channel is different too, at least for an oil manufacturing company. We are very brand focused because above and beyond whatever the regulations currently say, the brands have to be stewards of the consumer's interests. That's who they're accountable to. And you're seeing that in the news today. And while this is terribly disruptive and not good for the industry, the idea that consumer safety is important is something that we want to celebrate and lean into.
That was what I was really going to ask you next. This is big news just this past week about just the presence of pesticides in a lot of products. How do we deal with that? How do we fix that problem, which seems like a pretty significant problem in the industry?
Yeah, I think number one, we break that down into a few different parts. Number one, the regs need some evolutionary updating. There's 66 different, they're not all pesticides. They usually get thumbnailed as pesticides, but for those that are knowledgeable and they aren't here, there's pesticides, there's herbicides, there's miticides, there's fungicides, and there's even some household disinfectants. But they're bad for you. They shouldn't be consumed. And the DCC has defined these 66 or must pass a certain scrutiny. And 21 of them require that it be a non-detect, which just means it's at such a low part per billion level that the analytical instrumentation can't see it. And then on others, there are the other, I guess that leaves 45. On the other 45, there's an allowable limit that can pass. The goal being on those to also be a non-detect. So that's kind of the insider oil buying language around this. Clearly some brands had some oil that were beyond the allowable limits of those 66. And there's a few different ways that can happen. Number one, I think that the regulatory piece needs to be tightened up, and specifically the standardization for the test labs needs to be improved. There's differences between the labs, and some of them aren't that meaningful, but they should have the same protocol. They should have their instrumentations counted. But when we sell things by the gram, and we buy things by the pound, and our scales for intake and sales, they have to be licensed, calibrated, they're regulated for legal trade. The labs should have a similar rigor in terms of how their instrumentation is calibrated and the protocols that they run. We should expect a similar, if not, within a margin of error, we should expect the same result within that margin of error, lab to lab. We just don't see that. And I'll tell you specifically what we've done is we test at least 2 different labs. We don't offer anything for sale unless it's been dual tested at 2 different labs. Usually it's pretty similar, right? It was a non-detect at this lab and it's a non-detect at that lab. But if you look closely, the allowable limits are sometimes a little different. The limits of detection, the limits of quantification. And again, I don't know how into the weeds we want to get on this, but what we do is we offer that to our customers. Our rigor in terms of buying clean trim and turning it into clean oil, those lab reports are useful, and there's a good chance that one of the labs is more popular or more familiar to them. And then we can explain why we tested the other, right? This lab is actually more diligent about these things, and so that's why we use it. And while I feel like we were uniquely prepared for this moment, because we just have more data on the trim that we processed into oil, and then the finished goods oil itself is again tested before we offer it for sale. And this is not even a requirement. This is just something we do to provide our customers assurances that their brand isn't going to end up on the next, gotcha piece, right? It's not even about that. It's that their brand is actually being a good steward of consumer safety, consumer interests. That's really what it's about. That's how you create value. So there is variance. We need that sort of standardization on the labs. There's other regs that I'd like to see brought up to what we now know in 2024 versus what we knew in 2018 or when there was an update in 2021. So I do think we need some support and some help from the DCC in terms of leading through that. But also as it relates to this LA Times expose piece, there were some brands that got, maybe unbeknownst to them, but they bought oil, they used material that didn't pass the regulatory requirements, and that was out of bounds. And so you're seeing some recalls, and you're seeing this.
That's great, and I'm glad you were sort of talking about what you guys are doing yourselves, and maybe you could get into more of that. Maybe tell me about what do you look for in a supplier, what do you look for in a grower, where do you come down on outdoor versus indoor organic growing practices, that type of thing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, all these are banned in California cannabis. What often happens, that just to take it out of the sort of nefarious presumption here, what often happens is we buy majority outdoor grown cannabis. That's where we source our biomass. There's nothing better than the sunlight, and crops grown in healthy living soil is absolutely ideal. From time to time, the greenhouse, the light depths, the indoor, it makes sense. It becomes part of our supply base. They're held to the same regulatory standard, which is, again, it's got to be just ridiculously safe, clean, in the absence of these 66 undesirables, most of them pesticides. So they all go through that same rigor. But for us, with the majority supply being outdoor grown, there's exposure to their neighbor and the wind blowing the wrong way. There's an uncomfortably large allowable limit for almonds, for walnuts, for a lot of these other crops that are grown in California. And sometimes it's just this unfortunate trace that blew over, but we're tested to such a low level of parts per billion scrutiny that it can show up. And so for us, we just have to catch that at the indoor, right? Just before we even buy it, it goes through a testing protocol to confirm that it's completely clean or well below the allowable limits to the point where we can process the rest of it out.
Got it.
Right. Well, it's relatively simple. It's actually not easy to do. Our buying and testing rigor is notably more expensive than anything else that I'm familiar with in any other market. I'll share something with you too. Obviously the black market doesn't have any patience. There's a lot of legal states where there's still no requirement for consumer safety testing, notably pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, right? So it's not that California doesn't have this framework in place. It's that it needs to be updated and it needs to be enforced. The most usual and unfortunate thing that probably happened in these scenarios, these expose pieces, is somebody bought that oil. It was represented to be this homogeneous batch of, pick a number, 100 liters. And when I say modernizing how the steps, the sampling process itself is what needs to be updated. Like maybe we need to add in a few more pesticides that weren't around or weren't of concern 6 years ago that are now available or used in other crops that are near outdoor grows of cannabis. But the main thing is, it's like this liter tested clean, or it at least tested Cat 3 compliant, and this liter and this COA represents this entire batch of 100 liters. That's usually where it happens. And that's where the savvy buyers, especially the savvy brands that have buyers, that's their concern is this representative? If I went in and took a sampling out of every single one of these jars, would I get a uniform result again? And that's the rigor we deploy. We basically make our oil as if we're the brand owner so that we can provide those brand owners the assurance that this is exactly what we represented it to be. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It's not so much, or it's not as often, in my opinion, the labs struggling to execute their analytical exercise or making sure that they actually tested for all 66 of those analytes. It's more that the sample they were giving doesn't actually represent what it was attached and sold as.
Got it. Well, it's a complex problem.
For sure. It's a very technical it's commercially complex, regulatory complexity, and the technical piece is a little hard for most to navigate.
Yeah, well, you know what? I like the fact that our industry is pushing the envelope in terms of stringency of testing. Obviously, I would assume that these 66 compounds that you're referring to on the DCC list are not good to consume, whether they come to you on a tomato or an almond, or whether it comes in your oil. So now I think it's a very positive thing, and it sounds like our industry is really, for want of a better term, on the bleeding edge of that. That strikes me as very positive for agriculture and consumer goods in general.
Yeah, and it's easy to be critical of the DCC. They do need to do more. I will chime in on that. I also think we've got a framework. It's been evolving in a way that's been getting better, and we just need to keep it that way and do it in a way that's operationally reasonable, so that that most of the industry are good actors, and they do set out to make good products that are clean and compliant and are accurately represented. But, it's such a crappy old tagline, right? But it does take a couple of bad apples to have this situation happen.
Yeah.
And that just needs to be tightened up. There's really easy ways to make sure that this is not a problem. Some of the labs, they criticize each other for the deviation in potency. Unfortunately, potency has been dominating the conversation on products for just too long, and it really should be cleanliness, right? Is it the highest quality? And quality is not number one potency. Quality should be the absence of these undesirables, right? Was this farmed and packaged in a way that I can feel good about as a consumer?
Yeah.
So that our positioning here at Noble Pacific as an oil manufacturer is just simply that. High quality inputs, best practice manufacturing, an intense analytical rigor. We use our most stringent lab we sub-batch the raw materials as they come back, because the sampling process needs to be on a relatively small thing, like under 500 pound size batch. So it's big fluffy material. And then you have to execute that SOP with just maniacal consistency, right? That's how you find out. That's how you keep the bad stuff from coming in the building. And then once you're in, really good manufacturing processes and, good competent operators, great equipment. But we also use our most stringent lab. We also use them for our whip. We test the tincture, we test the crude, we test the post-decarb crude, because that's a process that can create other changes that impact the attributes of the finished goods. And then when we get to the end, that's when we dual test, if not test with 3 different labs on exactly what it is, so that we can accurately represent that to the brand that's buying.
Okay, great. Well, that's great to hear, that level of rigor. I think really important.
Out a better way to do it. So that's what we've advised the operating team, and we're well positioned for this moment. I don't think what's happening is generally good for the industry, so I'm not celebrating it. But I hope that it does help the buyers and the industry kind of think through the importance of, look, ultimately we're here to serve the consumer, and we're either taking those interests seriously or we're not.
And then, I think it's just also a great reminder that we as consumers need to be educated. We need to know who we're buying from and how seriously do they take this issue. And I think this is emblematic of the industry, that most cannabis consumers are health conscious. They're conscious of sustainability, and they're conscious of trying to take a healthy product. So I think it really it just goes back to that being an informed consumer is very important.
And it's so true, because the average consumer Well, you've got such diversity. I mean, it's very common, but they tend to consume less of it. They tend to be more health oriented.
Yeah.
Right? They tend to use less pharmaceuticals. There's not an immense amount of trust in the things that have been traditional medicine, right?
That's right.
And even if it's just recreational, it tends to be a harm reduction compared to alcoholic beverages or other things.
Mm-hmm.
And they absolutely do care. And it's a real violation of trust within that network of consumers. Like, it's not like we're selling Slim Jims and Mountain Dew here. Like, nobody thinks those things are good for you.
That's right.
So there's an expectation that's actually higher, and we need to clear that bar and then some.
Absolutely. Hear, hear. Well, that's great stuff. So, so maybe switching gears, and I think, you touched on this a little bit. Let's just talk a little bit about the industry in general. I know, obviously your background is also in capital raising. We've got issues right now. Obviously, the banking issue continues. Schedule 3, of course, is very much called into question, potentially based on recent Supreme Court decision on the Chevron case. Maybe you could just talk about the industry in general and in particular fundraising, and what do you see as the climate? Where do you see us now as an industry?
For starters, it's all good news, right? The banking issues related to Schedule 1 are cumbersome, to say the least, and a real repellent of traditional investment capital. So the descheduling is a huge step in the right direction. It's tailwinds. We're feeling a little bit of an opening up of capital markets. You're seeing more deals get done, and that's good news. Not a lot more, but a little more, and that's always where it starts whenever you're trying to rebuild. I think that of the companies that have survived this, they're just, the capital markets are terrible. You probably know better. At least 2 years, right? So unless you're capitalized in the way that we are, or had some other access to a different investment group, it's been challenging. There's no traditional channel that's really been doubling down in the last 2 years.
Right.
I think this regulatory piece is changing. Of the operating companies that are left, they had to have had some means of at least burning less cash, if not generating a slight operating profit, right? Otherwise, they just couldn't make it. The desperation of the others that didn't make it has made for some tough competition, if you know what I mean. Just imagine if somebody was having a going out of business sale every week and then take it times 5 for 2 years straight, right? Like, it creates some competitive alternative things that have been really tough to survive for everybody. But I do think that's getting better. I just think there's an exceptional skepticism about how quickly this actually becomes meaningful P&L impacting change.
Right.
And we'll take the good news and then just, it's kind of a cautious optimism as it relates to this things getting through, some banking reform, 288, 280E, they're all related to the scheduling.
Absolutely. Yeah. Interstate commerce.
But I do see it getting better. And I do think that of the good brands, the good operating companies, that we're starting to feel that to a small degree. And I think it could open up tremendously over the next 12 months.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
There's a lot of doom and gloom. So it's good to hear. Good to hear you talk that things are moving in the right direction. I would agree. I think that's the case. And I think this is really the storm that we all have to weather to stay in and have on the other side of all of this turmoil is a successful, healthy and vibrant industry that's really contributing to the overall growth of the economy.
I think so. And it's hard to describe that. There's a lot of status quo interests, pharmaceutical industry, big tobacco, alcohol.
Yeah.
They don't really want to see this industry thrive. And we're outgunned and we're outfunded on all lobbying, entrenched interests sort of fronts. It's hard to describe without sounding a little like a conspiracy theorist, and I'm definitely not. I think it's just, this is what's really hard about being a new industry.
Yeah.
And navigating these regulatory changes. As I mentioned, like, as frustrating as this LA Times piece is, and to have that, it is what provokes that next wave of change and improvement. And hopefully it awakens other markets, other states to realize, they need to have some sort of baseline safety standards in place. California needs to tune theirs up. And the good operators need to have enough reward to run their businesses properly and implement the diligence that prevents this happening again. But we're getting there. It's just, there's a lot of times where I've heard people say it feels like we brought a knife to a gunfight, and there's some big entrenched interests that don't really want to see this industry get off the ground. So it's fighting through that. The thing that is obvious now, though, is it's popular, it's acknowledged as medicinal benefit, it's scientifically proven, it's been well known for a long time. And like I said, it's all good news, and it will eventually make this a better environment to operate in, and you'll start to see that in the operating performance.
Excellent. Well, overall, a positive prognosis, so we appreciate that. Trent Overholt, thank you so much for being with us on Industry Trailblazers, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.
My pleasure. Good speaking with you.
Take care.